Roman Fever by Edith Wharton, read by Madeline Steck. From the table at which they had been lunching, two American ladies of ripe but well cared for middle age moved across the lofty terrace of the Roman restaurant and, leaning on its parapet, looked first at each other and then down on the outspread glories of the Palatine and the Forum, with the same expression of vague but benevolent approval. As they leaned, there a girlish voice echoed up gaily from the stairs leading to the court below. "Well, come along then," it cried, not to them, but to an invisible companion, "and let's leave these young things to their knitting." And a voice as fresh laughed back, "Oh, look here, Babs, not actually knitting." "Well, I mean figuratively," rejoined the first. "After all, we haven't left our poor parents much else to do." At that point, the turn of the stairs engulfed the dialogue. The two ladies looked at each other again, this time with a tinge of smiling embarrassment, and the smaller and paler one shook her head and colored slightly. "Barbara," she murmured, sending an unheard rebuke after the mocking voice in the stairway. The other lady, who was fuller and higher in color, with a small determined nose supported by vigorous black eyebrows, gave a good-humored laugh. "That's what our daughters think of us." Her companion replied by a deprecating gesture. "Not us individually, we must remember that. It is just the collective modern idea of mothers, and you see," half guiltily she drew from her handsomely mounted black handbag a twist of crimson silk run through by two fine knitting needles. "One never knows," she murmured. "The new system has certainly given us a good deal of time to kill, and sometimes I get tired of just looking, even at this." Her gesture was now addressed to the stupendous scene at their feet. The dark lady laughed again, and they both relapsed upon the view, contemplating it in silence, with a sort of diffused serenity which might have been borrowed from the spring effulgence of the Roman skies. The luncheon hour was long past, and the two had their end of the vast terrace to themselves. At its opposite extremity, a few groups, detained by lingering look at the outspread city, were gathered up guidebooks and fumbling for tips. The last of them scattered, and the two ladies were alone on the air-washed height. "I don't see why we shouldn't just stay here," said Mrs. Slade, the lady of the high color and energetic brows. The two derelict basket chairs stood near, and she pushed them into the angle of the parapet, and settled herself in one, her gaze upon the Palatine. "After all, it's the most beautiful view in the world." "It always will be, to me," assented her friend Mrs. Annesley, with so slight a stress on the "me" that Mrs. Slade, though she noticed it, wondered if it were not merely accidental, like the random underlinings of old-fashioned letter-writers. Grace Annesley was always old-fashioned, she thought, and added aloud, with a retrospective smile, "It's a view we've both been familiar with for a good many years. When we first met here, we were younger than our girls are now. You remember." "Oh, yes, I remember," murmured Mrs. Annesley, with now the same undefinable stress. "There's that head waiter wandering," she interpolated. She was evidently far less sure than her companion of herself and her rights in the world. "I'll cure him of wandering," said Mrs. Slade, watching her hand toward a bag discreetly opulent-looking as Mrs. Annesley's. Signing to the head waiter, she explained that she and her friend were old lovers of Rome, and would like to spend the end of the afternoon looking down on the view. That is, if it did not deserve the service. The head waiter, bowing over her gratuity, assured her that the ladies were most welcome, and would be still more so if they would condescend to remain for dinner. A full moon night, they would remember. Mrs. Slade's black brows drew together, as though references to the moon were out of place and even unwelcome, but she smiled away her frown as the head waiter retreated. "Well, why not? We might do worse. There's no knowing, I suppose, when the girls will be back. Do you even know back from where? I don't." Mrs. Annesley again colored slightly. "I think those young Italian aviators we met at the embassy invited them to fly to Tarragona for tea. I suppose they'll want to wait and fly back by moonlight." Moonlight. Moonlight. What a part it still plays. Do you suppose they're as sentimental as we were? "I've come to the conclusion that I don't know in the least what they are," said Mrs. Annesley, "and perhaps we didn't know much more about each other." "No, perhaps we didn't." Her friend gave a shy glance. "I never should have supposed you were sentimental, Aldia." Well, perhaps I wasn't. Mrs. Slade drew her lids together in retrospect, and for a few moments the two ladies, who had been intimate since childhood, reflected how little they knew each other. Each one, of course, had a label ready to attach the other's name. Mrs. Delphin Slade, for instance, would have told herself or anyone who asked her that Mrs. Horace Annesley 25 years ago had been exquisitely lovely. No, you wouldn't believe it, would you? Though, of course, still charming. Distinguished. Well, as a girl she had been exquisite, far more beautiful than her daughter Barbara, though certainly Babs, according to the new standards at any rate, was more effective. Had more edge, as they say. Funny where she got it, with those two nullities as parents. Yes, Horace Annesley was, well, just the duplicate of his wife. Museum specimens of old New York. Good looking, irreproachable, exemplary. Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Annesley had lived opposite each other, actually as well as figuratively, for years. When the drawing room curtains in number 20 East 73rd Street was renewed, number 23rd across the way was always aware of it, and all the little movings, buyings, travelings, anniversaries, illnesses, the tame chronicle of an estimable pair. Little of it escaped Mrs. Slade, but she had grown bored with it by the time her husband made the big coup in Wall Street, and when they bought in the Upper Park Avenue, had already begun to think, I'd rather live opposite of a speakeasy for a change. At least one might see it rated. The idea of seeing Grace rated was so amusing that, before the move, she launched a woman's lunch. It was a hit and made the rounds. She sometimes wondered if it had crossed the street and reached Mrs. Annesley. She hoped not, but didn't much mind. Those were the days when respectability was at a discount, and it did the irreproachable no harm to laugh at them a little. A few years later, and not many months apart, both ladies lost their husbands. There was an appropriate exchange of wreaths and condolences and brief renewal of intimacy in the half shadow of their mourning. And now, after another interval, they had run across each other in Rome at the same hotel, each of them the modest appendage of a salient daughter. The similarity of their lot had again drawn them together, lending itself to mild jokes and the mutual confession that, if in the old days it must have been tiring to keep up with their daughters, it was now, at times, a little dull not to. No doubt, Mrs. Slade reflected, she felt her unemployment more than poor Grace ever would. It was a big drop from being the wife of Delphin Slade to being his widow. She had always regarded herself, with a certain conjugal pride, as his equal in social gifts, as contributing her full share to the making of it the exceptional couple they were. But the difference after his death was interminable. As the wife of the famous corporation lawyer, always with an international case or two on hand, every day brought its exciting and unexpected obligation. The impromptu entertaining of eminent colleagues from abroad, the hurried dashes on legal business to London, Paris, or Rome, where the entertaining was so handsomely reciprocated, the amusement of hearing in her wakes, what, that handsome woman with the good clothes and eyes is Mrs. Slade, the Slade's wife. Really, generally, the wives of celebrities are such frumps. Yes, being the Slade's widow was dullish business after that. In living up to such a husband, all her faculties had been engaged. Now she had only her daughter to live up to, for the son who seemed to have inherited his father's gift had died suddenly in boyhood. She had fought through that agony because her husband was there to be helped and to help, but now, after that father's death, the thought of the boy had just become unbearable. There was nothing left but to the mother her daughter, and her dear Jenny was such a perfect daughter that she needed no excessive mothering. Now, with Babs Anley, I don't know that I should be so quiet, Mrs. Slade sometimes half enviously reflected. But Jenny, who was younger than her brilliant friend, was that rare accident, an extremely pretty girl who somehow made youth and prettiness seem as safe as their absence. It was all perplexing and to Mrs. Slade a little boring. She wished that Jenny would fall in love, with the wrong man even, that she might have to be watched, outmaneuvered, rescued. And instead it was Jenny who watched her mother, kept her out of draughts, made sure she had taken her tonic. Miss Stanley was much less articulate than her friend, and her mental portrait of Mrs. Slade was slighter and drawn with fainter touches. Alda Slade's awfully brilliant, but not as brilliant as she thinks, would have summed it up. Though she would have added, for the enlightenment of stranger, that Mrs. Slade had been an extremely dashing girl, much more so than her daughter, who was pretty, of course, and clever in a way, but had none of her mother's, well, vividness, someone had called it. Mrs. Anley would take up current words like this and cite them in quotation marks as unheard of audacities. No, Jenny was not like her mother. Something Mrs. Ansley thought Alia Slade was disappointed. On the whole, she had had a sad life, full of failures and mistakes. Miss Stanley had always been rather sorry for her. So these two ladies visualized each other, each to the wrong end of her little telescope. For a long time they continued to sit side by side without speaking. It seems as though to both there was a relief in laying down their somewhat futile activities in the presence of the vast memento mori which faced them. Mrs. Slade sat quite still, her eyes fixed on the golden slope of the Palace of Caesars, and after a while Mrs. Ansley ceased to fidget with her bag, and she too sank into meditation. Like many intimate friends, the two ladies had never before had an occasion to be silent together, and Mrs. Ansley was slightly embarrassed by what seemed, after so many years, a new stage in their intimacy, and one with which she did not know yet how to deal. Suddenly, the air was full of that deep clangor of bells which periodically covers Rome with a roof of silver. Mrs. Slade glanced at her wristwatch. 5 o'clock already, she said, as though surprised. Mrs. Ansley suggested interrogatively, "There's a bridge at the embassy at 5." For a long time, Mrs. Slade did not answer. She appeared to be lost in contemplation, and Mrs. Ansley thought the remark had escaped her. But after a while she said, as if speaking out of a dream, "Bridge, did you say? Not unless you want to. But I don't think I will, you know." "Oh, no," Mrs. Ainsley hastened to assure her. "I don't care to at all. It's so lovely here, and so full of old memories, as you say." She settled herself in her chair, almost furtively drew forth her knitting. Mrs. Slade took sideways note of this activity, but her own beautifully cared for hands remained motionless on her knee. "I was just thinking," she said slowly, "what different things Rome stand for to each generation of travelers. To our grandmothers, Roman fever; to our mothers, sentimental dangers, how we used to be guarded; and to our daughters, no more dangers than the middle of Main Street. They don't know it, but how much they're missing." The long golden light was beginning to pale, and Mrs. Ansley lifted her knitting a little closer to her eyes. "Yes, how we were guarded. I always think," Mrs. Slade continued, "that our mothers had much more difficult job than our grandmothers. When Roman fever stalked the streets, it must have been comparatively easier to gather girls at the danger hour. But when you and I were young, with such beauty calling us, and the spice of disobedience thrown in, and no worse risk than catching cold during the cool hour after sunset, the mothers used to be put to keep us in, didn't they?" She kept turning toward Mrs. Ansley, but the latter had reached a delicate point in her knitting. "1, 2, 3, slip 2, yes, that must have been," she assented, without looking up. Mrs. Slade rested on her with a deepened attention. "She can knit in the face of this. How like her." Mrs. Slade beat back, brooding, her eyes ranging from the ruins which faced her to the long green hollow of the Forum, the fading glow of the church fronts beyond it, and the outlying amenity of the Colosseum. Suddenly she thought, "It's all very well to say that our girls have done away with sentiment and moonlight, but if Babs Ansley isn't out to catch that young aviator, the one who's Marchese, then I don't know anything. And Jenny has no chance beside her. I know that too. I wonder if that's why Grace Ansley likes the two girls to go everywhere together. My poor Jenny is a foil." Mrs. Slade gave a hardly audible laugh, and at the sound of Mrs. Ansley dropped her knitting. "Yes? I oh, nothing. I was only thinking how your Babs carries everything before her. That Campolari boy is one of the best matches in Rome. Don't look so innocent, my dear. You know who he is. And I was wondering, ever so respectfully, you understood. Wondering how two such exemplary characters as you and Horace had managed to produce anything quite so dynamic." Mrs. Slade laughed again, with a touch of asperity. Mrs. Ansley's hands lay inert across her needles. She looked straight out at the great accumulated wreckage of passion and splendor at her feet, but her small profile was almost expressionless. At length she said, "I think you overrate Babs, my dear." Mrs. Slade's tone grew easier. "No, I don't. I appreciate her, and perhaps envy you. Oh, my girl's perfect. If I were a chronic invalid, well, I think I'd rather be in Jenny's hands. There must be times, but there! I always wanted a brilliant daughter, and never quite understood why I got an angel instead." Mrs. Annesley echoed her laugh in faint murmur. "Babs is an angel too." "Of course, of course. She's got rainbow wings. Well, they're wandering by the sea with their young men, and we sit here, and it all brings back the past a little too acutely." Mrs. Annesley resumed her knitting. One might have imagined, if one had known her less well, Mrs. Slade reflected, that for her also too many memories rose from the lengthening shadows of those August ruins. But no, she was simply absorbed in her work. What was there for her to worry about? She knew that Babs would almost certainly come back engaged to the extremely eligible Campolieri, and she'll sell the New York house and settle down near them in Rome and never be in their way. She's much too tactful. But she'll have an excellent cook and just the right people in for bridge and cocktails, a perfectly peaceful old age among her grandchildren. Mrs. Slade broke off this prophetic flight with a recoil of self disgust. There was no one of whom she had less right to think unkindly than of Grace Annesley. Would she never cure herself of envying her? Perhaps she began too long ago. She stood up and leaned against the parapet, filled her troubled eyes with the tranquilizing magic of the hour. But instead of tranquilizing her, the sight seemed to increase her exasperation. Her gaze turned down towards the Colosseum. Already its golden flank was drowned in purple shadow, and above it the sky curved crystal clear without light or color. It was a moment when afternoon and evening hang balanced in mid-heaven. Mrs. Slade turned back and laid her hand on her friend's arm. The gesture was so abrupt that Mrs. Annesley looked up, startled. "The sun set. You're not afraid, my dear?" "Afraid? Of Roman fever, pneumonia. I remember how ill you were that winter. As a girl you had a very delicate throat, hadn't you?" "Oh, we're all right up here. Down below in the Forum, it does get deathly cold all of a sudden, but not here." "Of course, you know because you had to be so careful." Mrs. Slade turned back to the parapet. She thought, "I must not make one more effort not to hate her." Aloud she said, "Whenever I look at the Forum from up here, I remember that story about a great aunt of yours, wasn't she? A dreadfully wicked great aunt? Oh, yes, great Aunt Harriet, the one who was supposed to have sent her younger sister out to the Forum after sunset to gather a night blooming flower for her album. All of her great aunts and grandmothers used to have albums of dried flowers." Mrs. Slade nodded. "But she really sent her because they were in love with the same man." "Well, that was the family tradition. They said Aunt Harriet confessed it years afterwards. At any rate, the poor little sister caught the fever and died. Mothers used to frighten us with the story when we were children, and you frightened me with it that winter when you and I were here as girls, the winter I was engaged to Delphin." Mrs. Annesley gave a faint laugh. "Oh, did I? Really frightened you? I don't believe you're easily frightened." "Not often, but I was then. I was easily frightened because I was too happy." "I wonder if you know what that means." Yes," Mrs. Annesley faltered. "Well, I suppose that was why the story of your wicked aunt made such an impression on me. And I thought, there's no more Roman fever, but the Forum is deathly cold after sunset, especially after a hot day. And the Colosseum's even colder and damper." "The Colosseum?" "Yes, it wasn't easy to get in after the gates were locked for the night. Far from easy. Still, in those days it could be managed. It was managed often. Lovers met there who couldn't meet elsewhere. You remember that?" I dare say I don't remember." "You don't remember? You don't remember going to visit some ruins or other one in the evening, just after dark, and catching a bad chill? You were supposed to have gone to see the moon rise. People always say that the expedition was what caused your illness." There was a moment's silence. Then Mrs. Annesley rejoined. "Did they? It was all so long ago." "Yes, and you got well again, so it didn't matter, but I suppose it struck your friends, the reason given for your illness. I mean, because everybody knew you were so prudent on account of your throat, and your mother took such care of you. You, ha- you had been out late sightseeing, hadn't you, that night? Perhaps I had. The most prudent girls aren't always prudent. What made you think of it now? Mrs. Slade seemed to have no answer ready, but after a moment she broke out. Because I simply can't bear it any longer. Mrs. Annesley lifted her head quickly. Her eyes were wide and very pale. Can't bear what? Why, you're not knowing that I've always known why you went. Why I went? Yes, you think I'm bluffing, don't you? Well, you went there to meet the man I was engaged to, and I can repeat every word of the letter that took you there. While Mrs. Slade spoke, Mrs. Annesley had risen unsteadily to her feet. Her bag, her knitting, and gloves slid in panic-stricken heap to the ground. She looked at Mrs. Slade as though she were looking at a ghost. No, no, don't, she faltered out. Why not? Listen if you don't believe me. My one darling, things can't go on like this. I must see you alone. Come to the Coliseum immediately after dark tomorrow. There will be somebody to let you in. No one whom you need fear will suspect. But perhaps you've forgotten what the letter said. Mrs. Annesley met the challenge with an unexpected composure. Steadying herself against the chair, she looked at her friend and replied, No, I know it by heart too. And the signature? Only your DS? Was that it? I'm right, am I? That was the letter that took you out that evening after dark. Mrs. Annesley was still looking at her. It seemed to Mrs. Slade that a slow struggle was going beyond the voluntary, controlled mask of her small, quiet face. I shouldn't have thought she had herself so well in hand, Mrs. Slade reflected, almost resentfully. But at this moment Mrs. Annesley spoke. I don't know how you knew. I burned that letter at once. Yes, you would, naturally. You're so prudent. The sneer was open now. And if you burn the letter, you're wondering how on earth I knew what was in it. That's the struggle, isn't it? Mrs. Annesley was still looking at her. It seemed to Mrs. Slade that a slow struggle was going on behind the voluntarily controlled mask of her small, quiet face. I shouldn't have thought she had herself so well in hand, Mrs. Slade reflected, almost resentfully. Mrs. Slade waited, but Mrs. Annesley did not speak. Well, my dear, I know what was in that letter because I wrote it. You wrote it? Yes. The two women stood for a minute staring at each other in the last golden light. Then Mrs. Annesley dropped back into her chair. Oh, she murmured and covered her face with her hands. Mrs. Slade waited nervously for another word or movement. None came, and at length she broke out. I horrify you. Mrs. Annesley's hands dropped to her knees. The face they uncovered was streaked with tears. I wasn't thinking of you. I was thinking it was the only letter I ever had from him. And I wrote it. Yes, I wrote it. But I was the girl he was engaged to. Did you happen to remember that? Mrs. Annesley's head drooped again. I'm not trying to excuse myself. I remembered. And still you went? Still I went. Mrs. Slade stood looking down on the small bowed figure at her side. The flame of her wrath had already sunk, and she wondered why she had ever thought there would be any satisfaction in inflicting so purposely a wound on her friend. But she had to justify herself. You do understand. I found out, and I hated you. Hated you. I knew you were in love with Delphin, and I was afraid. Afraid of you, of your quiet ways, your sweetness, well, I wanted you out of the way, that's all. Just for a few weeks, just till I was sure of him. So in a blind fury, I wrote that letter. I don't know why I'm telling you now. I suppose, said Mrs. Annesley slowly, it's because you've always gone on hating me. Perhaps, or because I wanted to get the whole thing off my mind. She paused. I'm glad you destroyed the letter. Of course, I never thought you'd die. Mrs. Annesley relapsed into silence, and Mrs. Slade, leaning above her, was conscious of a strange sense of isolation, of being cut off from the warm current of human communication. You think me a monster. I don't know. It was the only letter I had, and you say he didn't write it. Ah, you care for him still? I care for that memory, said Mrs. Annesley. Mrs. Slade continued to look down on her. She seemed physically reduced by the blow, as if when she got up the wind might scatter her like a puff of dust. Mrs. Slade's jealousy suddenly leaped up again at the sight. All these years the woman had been living on that letter. How she must have loved him to treasure the mere memory of its ashes. The letter of the man her friend was engaged to. Wasn't it she who was the monster? You tried your best to get him away from me, didn't you? But you failed, and I kept him. That's all. Yes, that's all. I wish now I hadn't told you. I had no idea you feel about it as you do. I thought you'd be amused. It happened so long ago, as you say, and you must do me the justice to remember that I had no reason to think you'd ever taken it seriously. How could I, when you were married to Horace Annesley 2 months afterward? As soon as you could get out of your bed, your mother rushed you off to Florence and married you. People were rather surprised. They wondered as it was being done so quickly. But I thought I knew. I had an idea you did it out of pique, to be able to say you'd get ahead of Delphin and me. Kids have such silly reasons for doing the most serious things, and you marrying so soon convinced me that you never really cared. Yes, I suppose it would, Mrs. Annesley assented. The clear heaven overhead was empty of all its gold. Dust spread over it, abruptly darkening the 7 hills. Here and there lights began to twinkle through the foliage at their feet. Steps were coming and going on the deserted terrace. Waiters looking out of the doorway at the head of the stairs, then reappearing with trays and napkins and flasks of wine. Tables were moved, chairs straightened. A feeble string of electric lights flickered out. A stout lady in a dust coat suddenly appeared, asking in broken Italian if anyone had seen the elastic band which held together her battered Baedeker. She poked with her stick under the table at which she had lunched, the waiters assisting. The corners where Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Annesley sat was still shadowy and deserted. For a long time neither of them spoke. At length Mrs. Slade began again. I suppose I did it as a sort of joke. A joke? Well, girls are ferocious sometimes, girls in love especially. And we're laughing to myself all evening at the idea that you were waiting around there in the dark, dodging out of sight, listening for every sound, trying to get in. Of course I was upset when I heard you were so ill afterward. Mrs. Annesley had not moved for a long time, but now she had turned toward her companion. But I didn't wait. He arranged everything. He was there. We were let in at once, she said. Mrs. Slade sprang up from her leaning position. Delphin there? They let you in? Ah, now you're lying, she burst out with violence. Mrs. Annesley's voice grew clear and full of surprise. But of course he was there. Naturally he came. Came? How did he know he'd find you there? You must be raving. Mrs. Annesley hesitated, as though reflecting. But I answered the letter. I told him I'd be there, so he came. Mrs. Slade flung her hands up to her face. Oh, God, you answer. I never thought of you answering. It's odd you never thought of it if you wrote the letter. Yes, I was blind with rage. Mrs. Annesley rose and drew her fur scarf about her. It is cold here. We'd better go. I'm sorry for you, she said as she clasped the fur about her throat. The unexpected word sent a pang through Mrs. Slade. Yes, we'd better go. She gathered up her bag and cloak. I don't know why you should feel sorry for me, she muttered. Mrs. Annesley stood looking away from her toward the dusky mass of the Colosseum. Well, because I didn't have to wait that night. Mrs. Slade gave an unquiet laugh. Yes, I was beaten there, but I oughtn't to begrudge it to you, I suppose. At the end of all these years, after all, I had everything. I had it for 25 years, and you had nothing but that one letter that he didn't write. Mrs. Annesley was silent again. At length she took a step toward the door and out of the terrace, and turned back, facing her companion.